he begins basically dunking on crowd psychologists from 200 years ago, a few hundred years ago, who sort of talked about crowds, and I think this sort of equated to the lumpen proletariat idea in Marx or Marxism, the bourgeois disdain of crowds, you know, the bourgeois philosophy, particularly of, like, say, 200 years ago, the clean, distinct, independent manner of men at the time. When they spoke of populism, they spoke about it in terms of its content. So if you had like traditional political centers that had clear ideological frontiers, the left, the right, or whatever, and they'd be going at it, that was distinguished, this is the way it's done, blah blah blah. Whereas populism, any populist intervention, was seen as sort of breaking these rules, like stepping on the toes of the establishment, essentially. And they spoke of populism in terms of ambiguity. So the content was ambiguous. It was painted as irrational and lacking in understand. I don't know. Sorry. Painted as irrational and linked with women and drunkards. So if say hypothetically, if a member of this male establishment, this higher political community, was to somehow descend into a populist movement, they would be, I suppose they would be scorned. I imagine they would be scorned in terms of like an irrational, hysterical woman or a drunkard, and blamed for the dissolution of society. So bourgeois society saw mob rule would be one way of phrasing, I suppose, as something that really threatened not the dissolution of society in a total sense, but their society, a real threat. So the sort of the discourse of the time was directed at suppressing the legitimacy of those elements in society.
Okay.
But Laclau, to its defense, argued that it had its own rationality and that the analysis of the day lacked an understanding of the cultural context. He argues that it's not about the content of the politics, and we'll get into that a bit further down the line, but it's about sort of the form that it takes. And it's a performative act rather than a contented ideology, like rather than like a content-full ideology like higher politics. It's performative. It's not cognitive. It's an act. It's not a theory. And the importance Laclau attributes to the ambiguity of that content or lack of content. He attributes it, the ambiguity to sort of the very possibility of constructing political meaning. And this is and I don't feel like we've touched on the affective dimension enough. I think we mentioned it, but possibly only in the context of art last chat. But actually, it sort of features a little bit more heavily with Laclau and Mouffe. But it's basically the sort of the emotional and actuating dimension. And I put those two things together because it's not merely emotional. It's not merely just acting, but it's where impulse sort of manifests a blend of both acting and emotion. I suppose like impulse would almost be like an unconscious action. So words evoke images often more important than their signification. So you can say words, you can have a cognitive, ideological treatise, speech, and it's not so much the content of the words, that what they're saying, the signification, but it's the images that they evoke, and the passion that it instills in people, and the identification that that so as the hypothetical where like a political speech would sort of generate identity or identification in whatever the movement was, that was where the speech was coming from, through the identification will come through the emotion, the passion, rather than the particular words and the content. So Laclau is sort of dashing that early analysis of crowd psychology and populist movements, is saying it's absurd to put it on par with ideology, with conceptual politics. However, it is the sort of the emotional performative act of politics, and it is the delivery system for political meaning, basically. I suppose is what he's sort of saying there. And it's rhetorical. It's a rhetorical strategy. Well, I mean, okay, a populist movement is a material body of people, but when we're talking about populist politics, I suppose it's about rhetoric.